In 1867, after the Civil War, Freemasons of Kentucky got together to decide what to do with the widows and orphans of soldiers who had fought and died in the Civil War. They formed a place called the Masonic Widows and Orphans Home in Louisville, Kentucky, and originally was in downtown Louisville, but by 1917, 1918, between World War I and the Spanish flu epidemic, the home was so overcrowded they just needed to build a newer place. They were able to purchase 180 acres of real estate on the eastern boundary of Louisville and started building the campus, which would be the new location of the Masonic Widows and Orphans Home on Frankfort Avenue in Louisville, which is still there today. They moved all the kids and the widows there, and over the next few years, more and more kids were sent there until by the 1930s they had 600 kids living there. They had their own school, they had their own farm, basically they had a print shop, and basically it was a self-contained city. By the 1950s, the student population had dropped to the point where they closed the school and they sent the kids to public schools, and then over the next 20 years there were less and less kids, more and more widows. And what happened at that point, by 1989, the last kid who was considered a Masonic home orphan, even though most of them were not orphans, they were from broken families, either divorce, death of one parent, or in a few cases actually both parents. But after that, instead of just abandoning the place, they decided to turn it into a senior citizens home. They sold off most of the farmland property. They tore down one building, and they converted all the rest of them into different types of apartments. And it is still there today, but it is completely open to the public as far as who can be there. Now, how I ended up being there, my father, Russell Kraft, was a member of the Masonic Lodge in Ashland, Kentucky, and he passed away in December of 1962. There is a picture that was taken in Florida. It's my dad, my mom, and I. That was taken in January of 62, and as far as I know, it is the last photograph of the three of us together. After he died, my mom was approached about sending me to the Masonic home, and for whatever reason, she chose not to and felt we would be able to stay together. She received a certain amount of money from the railroad when my dad died, plus she was getting a railroad check every month because of me. She took some of the money, bought a small house, and we lived there until 6 years later. She got sick, and she eventually would die in January 1969 from stomach cancer. When my mom got sick, she made out a will, but for whatever reason, she chose not to put what would be happen to me. So when she died, I was 12 and a half years old, and I wanted to live with my grandparents because all I had to do was change neighborhoods and not change cities and change schools, and the courts agreed. So I went to live with my dad's mother and stepfather until she passed away in 1972. And at that point, talking to my school counselors after that, I mentioned the fact that I had nobody to sign for papers. They were fully aware of what was going on, and she wanted to know what I wanted to do, and for whatever reason, I mentioned the Masonic home. Turned out most of the male members of the high school belonged to different Masonic organizations, so they got the ball rolling, and within 6 weeks, I was at the Masonic home. At the time, I was living in Ashland. The local newspapers would publish obituaries, and some company would then take those obituaries and seal them in plastic and mail them to people for donations. That's how I still have a copy of my mom and dad's obituary. Before I went to the home, there had to be a meeting at the local lodge that for the approval for me to be sent there. mostly basically a formality. So I kept that notice from the newspaper to enlarged it so it was easier to read, and that's why this notice appears in this book. The last day I lived in Ashland, one of the guys that took me to Louisville took a picture of me standing on the steps of the high school. When we got there, it was in springtime, April 28th, 1972, and everything was bright, luscious green, and the buildings were beautiful. The buildings that we lived in, they referred to them as cottages. The unit that I lived in was called Cottage 4. It was designed to hold 90 people, but at the time I moved there was only, I think, about 12 of us in my building, and then 12 more boys in the building next door. And then down on the other end of the campus, in what was called Cottage 1, is where the girls lived at. I was interested in photography when I moved there, and I had a Kodak Instamatic camera, which wasn't going to work, and I started saving, trying to find a way to save up some money to get a camera. They would give us 35 cents every morning to buy lunch at the school cafeteria, so I would eat a big breakfast and then save the 35 cents. Also had a small job at the school, and I was getting a little bit of money from there, and I could do odd jobs around the home. And by the first week of December, I found a camera in a store that I could afford, put it on layaway, and then on the second Friday of December, and there's a reason why I remember that, of 1972, I took the money I had and I went there and picked up the camera. It was a Mamiya Secor 35mm camera, totally manual, nothing was automatic on it at all. But it was functionable, and it was also the board meeting night at the Masonic home, which was always held the second Friday of each month. Got there in time for dinner. I was showing some of the kids the camera I bought, and one of the Masons, or members of the board, who was from the Ashland area, wanted to see it. So when I was showing it to him, he said, "Do you have any film?" And I didn't want to tell him that I used every penny I had to get the camera. I just told him, no, I'm just going to get that later. And when he shook my hand and he pulled it back, he left a $10 bill in my hand, and he said, "Go buy yourself some film." My first pictures with that camera, again, was in December of 1972. Just before that, I had set up a dark room in the basement where I had my stuff stored at, and kept working on it, trying to figure out different ways. I finally learned how to develop black and white film, and through trial and error, I was eventually able to learn how to even print the pictures up. And from that point on, I started taking more and more pictures. What was nice about it was when I was taking the pictures, especially of the kids, I would bring that camera out, and the kids would go right along with it. Nobody ever said, "No, don't take my picture." They went along with it. They posed. They didn't run away. And today, now I hear them always say, "Oh, we're so happy that you took the pictures," and I always like reminding them that they were just as much responsible, because they would let me do it. So one of the first things you see when you get to the Masonic home is the entrance. And typical early architecture, stone, brick, big column in the center, right off the railroad tracks. So you pass through that to go onto the grounds. The building that I lived in, Cottage 4, would eventually be torn down, but it was huge. And what was unique about the building, all the screen windows on that building, and there was a lot of them, the screens were not interchangeable, because these buildings were basically hand-built. Everything was handmade. So when we would wash the screens on the first floor, we were not allowed to. We had to take them out and wash them one at a time, because otherwise, if you mixed them up, you'd never get them straight. And when they tore the building down in 1988, they figured they were going to build something new there, so they hired a contractor to come in to wreck the building. The story goes that when they swung a wrecking ball and hit the side of the building, the ball bounced off the wall. The building was so well constructed that it literally bankrupted the contractor. Everything was steam heated, so sometimes at night the pipes in the building would start hammering, get the hammer sound to them. Sometimes the steam in the wintertime would be so excessive, sometimes you go in the basement and it would be sort of a fog in the basement. But it was really a nice place, and looking back, I was lucky to be there. We had a school bus from the 1950s that would pick the kids up and take us to the public school. It was blue and gray. I think it was designed to hold maybe 20-25 people, so it was not a full-size bus. When we would get there, we would be parked right in front of the school drop-off. Everybody else, they'd drop them off a little way from the school, but they pulled right up in front of the school for us. Fortunately, the high school that we went to, which was Wagner High School, was one of the richest schools in Jefferson County, but the students were so nice. They were so friendly. They accepted all of us, never made fun, never, even some would even come over to visit. Didn't like the fact that we had to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning, but they would come and visit, and I had several friends that would come over. Every year in May, at the end of May, they would call it Grand Master's Day. In the Masonic order, the Grand Master is the top person for the state, each state. So people from all over the state would come to the home, and they would parade us around, showing everybody what a great job they were doing with the kids. And it was sort of, at that time, it was a reunion for kids who had lived there in the past. Since they don't have that program anymore, the reunion now falls at the last weekend of June. We still get together for a reunion. A couple of people who were involved with the home. First one was Miss Laura Johnson. She came to the Masonic home 2 years after it opened up at its current location, which it opened in 1927. She arrived there in 1929 as a school teacher. She would eventually become the principal of the school. And when the school closed in the middle 50s, she became in charge of dealing between the home and the different schools the kids had to go to. Miss Johnson retired from the Masonic home in 1986. She had spent almost 57 years working there. And when she retired, she was still Miss Johnson. She'd never married. And what was big joke was there was two things that she never revealed. She never revealed her age or her politics. But when she retired, at that time, only widows of Masonic members could live at the Masonic home. They made an exception for Miss Johnson and allowed her to become a resident. And she stayed there as a resident until she passed away in 1990. And I think we found out at that time she was just in her 80s when she passed away. Last time I saw her was in 1988. The second person that did a lot of work there was Mr. Carl Market. He was the high school band director at the school that we went to. He was also a member of the Masonic lodges, and when he retired, he would come out to the home to work with the kids trying to learn music. Problem was, he'd only do it once a week, and the kids who had the ability to do it, it wasn't enough time. And he put his heart and soul into it, and everybody really liked him. And he passed away several years ago also. All right, this picture here is a picture of the girls who lived at the home at the time I was there. And this picture was taken in May of '73. They had the girls in a separate building. It was one building we called Cottage 1. Some of them were sisters to the boys in our buildings, and a couple of them were there on their own. In June of each summer, they would have a carnival on the grounds of the home. They called it the St. John's Day Picnic. Not quite sure how it came up with the name, but for about a month beforehand, they would start setting up booths for games, and then a few days before it would arrive, they would bring in rides, and it was a full-blown carnival. People from all over the area would come to it. Of course, the kids had free roam of it, and we had a lot of fun. It was all the different rides, the games, getting to see people. One of the interesting things is they would have a ribbon cutting ceremony, and when they did the ribbon cutting, they invited the kids from the Catholic St. Joe's Orphanage, which was just about a mile down the street from us. And this was a picture of the ribbon cutting in June of '73. This picture is two of the girls from Cottage One, Kathy and Diane, on one of the rides. This picture here is in front of I think it was a coin booth, toss booth, I'm not sure, but this is an interesting picture. There are two sets of brothers in this picture. There's Paul with the long hair and the headband. His younger brother Steve, who's the tall one. The little guy is Doyle. Now Doyle was from a family of 11 kids, and the gentleman in the middle with the sunglasses was his brother Lester. At the time the Stewart's father passed away, Lester was too old to come to the Masonic home, but he came there enough times that everybody got to know him as just a family and friends. This picture on the paratrooper ride was Dennis Brown and his wife. Dennis lived at the Masonic home from 1962 till 1970. This photograph is two of the high executives in the Masonic order. It was Cliff Wilder on the left and Gay Price on the right. Gay Price was from the Ashland area. One of them was a former Grand Master, and one of them would be a future Grand Master. And they were in charge of one of the booths. There was a lot of open field in the middle of the grounds. There was enough of us that we could put together some types of sports games. Sometimes in the summertime it was softball, and of course in the fall it was football, and in the winter there was a gymnasium, and then if we could get them to allow us, we could go over there and play basketball. These two photographs I took during a game of softball, and it was Diane at bat, Gary Hahn with a broken arm pitching, Gary Myers with his hands on his knees coaching, Richie was playing the catcher, and then Debbie was in the background. In the second picture we got Gary Myers pitching, Reuben watching, Sam Brown catching, and Stan Stewart had can't tell, no, I think the ball was coming to him, and I think he hit it pretty far. These two folks here, picture on the left, that's Joyce Meyer playing in the outfield. Okay, and the person pitching was Gary Hahn. Somehow, I forgot what happened, what he was doing, but he broke his arm that summer. And then this one is Donna Brown pitching. This next group of pictures, a couple of the kids had went to help one of the volunteers clean out her attic. And instead of giving them money, she gave them these old army suits. Well, they loved the army anyway, so they were happy to get them. So it was one night in the summer of '73, before lights out, which was around 10 o'clock, Jack Stewart, the guy in the officer's uniform, decided, let's have some fun with this. So they all put the uniforms on and decided to pose for the pictures that I was taking. It's Chuck Hamilton on the left with the cigarette in his mouth, Jack in the middle, and his younger brother Stan. And before I go any farther, all three of them eventually would serve in the military, with Stanley retiring as a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army. The first shot, of course, was Jack the officer being his enlisted men having to take care of him. That's why he's shining his shoes, making sure his hat's straight, and he's showing them exactly who's in control. When they got out of line in the third picture, Jack was going to show them what would happen if they got out of line. However, for some reason, after Jack acted like after he throws the punch, they get the upper hand. Jack ends up on the floor, and they show what they're going to do to him. We had Stan Stewart with his hand on the canteen, Charles Hamilton, called him Chuck, with the cigarette in his mouth, and of course, Colonel Jack Stewart. We still get a good laugh out of these pictures. Stanley was really into the military, and you can't see it all, but if you notice on top of the lockers, there are tanks. There were model tanks all the way across both of those ladders. This next picture that I'm going to show has been one of the all-time favorites. Some people have referred to it as a Norman Rockwell type photograph. But it was in the summer of '73, probably around July. We were all out, some of us, not all the boys, were out behind Cottage 4, and I had my camera. By that time, I had bought a tripod. I set the camera up on a tripod, I did a test photo, and then I asked everybody to get in the picture. I set the timer, which was a 10-second timer. I go to run to get into the picture, and I slip and fell flat on my face, which is a true story. I had to jump up and get into the picture just before the camera went off. And again, we've always laughed at this picture because it's just your typical stereotype orphans. So the story behind the people in the picture, the gentleman on the right with the rifle is Dennis Brown. Now this is in 1973, and he had already been out of the home for 3 years. One of the things about old home kids, as we were called, is they tended to come back to visit. Either they had family there or they just came back to visit. So it wasn't uncommon to have one of the former home kids there. In this case, Dennis's brother Richie is the person standing on the crutches, was there. The gentleman behind him with the green beret hat was Steve Bowling. Steve had left the home in 1971, and he just finished up his second year of college. Steve was at that time was in ROTC, and that's the reason why he's got the gun and the gun belt. Because Steve and his family had no former family to stay with, during the first 3 summers of his college year, he would come back and stay at the home and then work there. Other people in the picture, starting from the left in the front, the guy that's looking real glum, that's Sam Brown. The kid holding the glove over his face is Brian Stewart. He was the youngest of the kids in this picture. Brian said he had gotten a black eye that day, and he had a glove full of ice water, and he was holding it up to his eye. The person standing behind him with that stare on his face is Doyle Stewart, Brian's brother. Behind Brian was Virgil Hamilton. His brother and sister came to the home in '72, but their mother wanted them back, and she took them back a year later. Behind Steve Bowling, whose face is partially obscured, is Stan Stewart, the brother to Doyle and Brian. To his right, holding the clock, was Billy Meyer, and to his left was Gary Hahn. And as again, like I said, it was just a spur of the moment. Everybody was there. We grabbed everybody, put them in the picture, and that's how we ended up like that. And again, one of the more popular pictures from the home. The next picture of Steve in the ROTC outfit, I always got a chuckle because Steve's family came to the Masonic home. He was the youngest of 5 kids, and he came to the Masonic home in 1957 after his parents were killed in a plane crash. He stayed there from 1957 till he finished high school in 1971, so he was there for 14 years. I always get a chuckle with Steve because his middle name was Kraft, same as my last name, and never knew the reason why. Well, I've been always interested in genealogy, and a couple of years ago I got involved with Ancestry.com, and I started tracing the families, and it turned out that Steve's family and my dad's family have a common ancestor. And even though my last name's Kraft, the Kraft name came from a different Kraft family in Kentucky. But this particular Kraft, it was one of his daughters that eventually became my grandmother's descendant. When I seen Steve this past year, I got to finally tell him, guess what? We're related. I think he said, I'm going to have to check that out. But and it turned out that there was one of his ancestors was named Stephen Kraft. As far as food goes, one of the things about the home, nobody went hungry. They had more than enough food for everybody to eat. You could eat as much as you could handle, and I tried to challenge them on that, but it didn't work. At the Masonic home, we had a main dining hall located in the center of the campus. It was built to handle 600 people at one time, but we ate our meals there 3 times a day except on Saturday. It was twice on Saturday. In the evenings, we would just eat some sandwiches or something at the individual cottages. What would happen is, first thing that would happen is they had a steamboat whistle on the boiler room. They would sound that for 30 seconds. You could hear it all over the area. After the whistle, maybe 10 minutes later, somebody would ring the bell in the dining hall, which meant you had about 5 minutes to get there before dinner started. We would assemble in the hall. The widows would be sitting, the ones who were able to walk, would sit, but all the kids had to stand. Then the lady who was in charge of the boys would come in, and she would stand there, and she would ring a little bell, and then she would say a simple prayer. Our gracious Heavenly Father, we thank Thee for this food. In Jesus' name, amen. And then we would eat. We only had about 20-25 minutes to eat, so eating fast was a thing. But we always had more than enough food. We had plenty of milk. If you ran out of an item, you would hold your plate up, or the bowl up. Usually one of the girls would be in charge of keeping tabs on the food. She would grab your bowl, take it back, they'd fill it back up and bring it back out. When dinner was done, the girls would collect all the dirty plates, bring them in the back, and a group of boys would run the industrial-sized dishwasher. When the dishes came out, they'd go back out, and the girls would set them back out for the next meal. The food was good. We had a master chef, which there is a picture of him. He was in charge of most of it, plus we had a couple of cooks that could put together some very good meals. Food was never an issue. In the summer of '73, the home decided to take the kids who were there for the summer, who hadn't went someplace to visit family. They took us out to Cherokee Park, and we spent the day there, had a picnic. We got to go around. A lot of the kids went in wading in the creeks. Some got up to their waist in the water. But one of the most interesting pictures that I took was Brian Stewart. He was walking toward me on the path, and I pointed the camera at him, and he had a piece of watermelon in his hand, so he just stuck it up to his face like that, like he was eating the watermelon. Stan Stewart was in the water acting like he was going to throw a rock like it was a hand grenade. The next picture on the teeter-totter, I forgot the man's name, but he was basically like a counselor. So the girl sitting next to him, that's Diana Brown. She was one of the youngest people that was living at the home at that time. And then there's Diane Hamilton and then Richie Brown on the other end. An event that happened shortly afterwards, we've always got a chuckle out of, was in Cottage 4. Again, it's dormitory, so it was the middle of the summer afternoon, probably on a weekend, and Steve Bowling had decided he's going to take a nap. Now, Steve's laying on Gary Meyer's bed. Steve was about 6'3" and played football. And at the home, roughing up each other was the way you did stuff. What was considered cruel and unusual punishment was just the way everybody did to each other. So Steve's laying on the bed, and I took a picture of him with a flash on my camera. Then I took the second picture from a higher angle. Well, Steve wasn't fully asleep, so he's seen me taking the pictures. He's seen me getting ready to aim the camera again, so he buried his face in the blanket and the pillow, not knowing that Richie, Carlos Adams in the background, and Doyle Stewart were going to embellish the picture a little bit. So they looked like they were just going to take him apart. When I showed Steve this picture, needless to say, all 4 of us got a good beating, because the 3 of them for doing that and for me for taking the picture. Again, it was all in good fun. We still get a good laugh out of it. In this picture, we have Carol Hahn on the left, Richie in the middle, Richie Brown, and Diane Hamilton on the right. And if you notice, Diane is holding one of the pictures from when we did the little thing with the guys dressed up in the uniforms, because Diane was the sister of one of the people. At this point, people may wonder, what happened with Richie's leg? In 1962, Richie, his twin sister, his mother and father were in a car as they went to cross an unguarded, blinded railroad track. You could not see a train coming, and the car got broadsided. The train, it killed Richie's sister, and it killed his father and severely injured his mother. Dennis wasn't in the car at the time. Richie ended up losing his leg. So in 1962, Richie and his brother Dennis were sent to the Masonic home, and that's where Richie stayed until he graduated high school in 1976. One of the benefits, sad benefits of that, was the Masonic home took care of all of his medical expenses. And he's told me how, as he grew, he had to get a new leg every year. He and Miss Johnson would take a train from Louisville to Grand Rapids, Michigan to get another leg fitted for him. Richie eventually wrestled in high school. They even did a news article about that. It was just one of those things, one of the reasons why many of us were there. So, moving right along. This photograph was again in the summer of '73. Was right after, I just think it wasn't right after dinner. I think it was just on a Saturday afternoon or something. A bunch of us were hanging out in front of the dining hall. I set the camera up on a tripod, and we just jumped into it and we did this photo. We got Brian on Richie's crutches, Charles Hamilton behind him, Diane Hamilton, Carol Hahn holding her hair, Richie in between us, and then of course me. In 2010 was a reunion where most of us got back together, and those of us who were available plus a couple of substitutes recreated this picture. In front of the print shop there was a water line, and what they would do is every summer they would set up a homemade water fountain. And the way it worked was, it was sort of like a still. It was a huge cabinet, and inside the cabinet was copper tubing that coiled all the way up through the cabinet. And every day they would dump approximately 50 gallons of ice into that barrel that would fill it all the way to the top, so that water would come up through that copper tube and would be ice cold as it came out of the faucet. In this particular case, that's me standing there with Doyle Stewart, and I'm wearing somebody's hat. I think I was wearing Steve's hat for some reason, because I normally didn't wear a hat. Okay, this next series of pictures, I was walking down the road going toward the main entrance, and when I passed Cottage 1, Donna Brown was standing on the ledge on the first floor windows, which they were approximately 8 to 10 feet above the ground. They had to they're cleaning the windows from the outside. So I pointed my camera, and of course Donna posed. Well, then Joyce Meyer walked out also, so she's standing on the ledge. And the two of them then did a pose for me at the end. And we look at that today, as you can see their feet are literally hanging over the ledge. How dangerous that probably was. Okay, the home, as I said earlier, set on 180 acres of what would be considered prime real estate in the Louisville area. Our eastern fence was literally the boundary between Louisville and St. Matthews, Kentucky. A sidebar on that one is the actor Ned Beatty supposedly grew up on the other side of that fence. But the back half of it went all the way back to the Crescent Hill Golf Course. And it was a bluff in the back that literally, it was a cliff. I don't remember exactly how high above the golf course it was. But when you got back in there, there was a creek, and it was pretty much wooded over. So it was a place to disappear. There are stories, Dennis will tell you a story, that some of the older boys in the days before I got there would go back there with a pellet gun, and they would see somebody on the golf course. The ball would fall in the golf course in front of them. They said they would take aim and shoot at the balls. So anyway, in the summer of '73, Jack Stewart, Carol Hahn, and her brother Gary would sneak off, and yes, I did say sneak because they didn't tell anybody they were going, would go just to the other side of the property, which is where the Crescent Hill swimming pool was at. And I happened to be standing up on the cliff one day, and I seen the three of them walking, and I knew where they were going, so I snapped the picture of them as they were walking by. We always get a good chuckle over that now. This picture is, again, of Miss Johnson. And again, story with Miss Johnson that I've already told you about was that she could remember every kid who she ever worked with. And the crazy thing was, it didn't matter what era you were there. If you were there anywhere from the 1930s up to the 1980s, everybody knew Miss Johnson. And I just happened to catch her one day. I guess you could say, in some respects, she was your typical Southern, well-educated, college graduate person. She had a way of knowing how to bite her tongue. I mean, she would never really tell people, especially if she didn't agree with what was going on. She just knew how not to say anything and basically just tell you to move on. All right, these are some of the employees who worked there. The first person standing there with his hands on his hips was John Stone. We called him Pappy. Don't know where that name come from, but that was his name. He was an assistant cook, so he helped out in the afternoons and helped put dinners together in the evening. He lived in one of the buildings that the home provided that was just off the campus employee residency. And I always laughed because he always wanted us to take a bucket of ice to his house so he could have a cool one when he got home. The next lady with the glasses on and one of her many wigs was, I believe her last name was Kersey, but I think it was her. We always just knew her as Helen Kersey. She was quite a character. She was very, very loud, loved to sing, and she loved to cook, and she just loved the kids. And one of the funny stories about her was a breakfast. It's hard to cook fried eggs for 100 people in a short amount of time and keep them and get them to be still fresh when they bring them out. So a lot of times we would joke that the eggs were like rubber by the time they came out to us. Well, for some reason, however she was doing it, she was cooking that morning, and the eggs were as good. Fried eggs were perfect. We kept sending them back, and it ended up that 8 boys went through 4 dozen fried eggs that morning. When the tornado hit in 1974, I was in that building, and we were rushing for shelter, and Helen froze. I mean, she couldn't move. And it's like, come on, Helen, you have to go. You have to go. We got to get to the basement. And finally got her to move and get down into the basement. Fortunately, the tornado bypassed us, and there's more on that later. This gentleman here, Mr. Ray Woosley, he was a gourmet chef. He was also a member of the Masonic order, and how he ended up working at the home, I don't know. He could come up with some fantastic meals, especially on board meeting night. Every time I'd walk back there, I'd walk into the dining room because I had a reputation of being able to eat a lot. He'd look at me and say, "Oh God, we better kill another chicken." And for honest to God, I think Colonel Sanders got his crispy chicken recipe from Mr. Woosley, because he was serving crispy fried chicken way before Kentucky Fried Chicken ever put that out. The girl standing there is Kathy Chapman. It was her turn to do dining hall duty, so they're loading food onto the trays, and then she'd bring the tray out and set the tables. This gentleman with the glasses on, his real name was Harold Ammons. We called him Curly. I don't know where that one came from, but he was the delivery guy on the home. He was responsible for making sure that food was transported to the infirmary, that food was transported to the buildings for women who were unable to walk, where they had their own dining area. He made all kinds of deliveries. He picked up stuff, and he also made mail deliveries, or took the mail from our post office, took it down to the main post office in downtown Louisville. I worked with him for a little bit. That's how I got some of the extra money to buy the camera. His wife was what they would call a relief matron. She was in charge of coming to work in each building as they were, when they would give the person in charge the night off. The next picture, and unfortunately this is the only picture I have of George Beswick. He was a maintenance supervisor. And looking at him straight on, he was the spitting image of John Wayne. And he would play that up. I remember one time seeing him on a riding lawnmower with a 10-gallon Stetson on, and you would have thought it was John Wayne. Unfortunately, he passed away about 2 weeks after I took this photograph, so I never got another chance to take the picture. I don't know exactly what he's seen, but he's seen something out in the back, and that's why he had the binoculars. He wanted to see what was going on. This lady was in charge of the infirmary. She was basically the head nurse, and for some reason she was sitting there, and I pointed the camera at her, and she posed, but she gave me that look like, what are you doing? I think her name was Mrs. Norton. Of course I would forget it for the moment. This gentleman was Mr. William Wallace. He was the superintendent of the Masonic home. He came to the Masonic home 1 month after I got there. Unfortunately, he was not very sociable. He was an interesting character, but he preferred, when he did come to the dining hall to eat, he would they had a table set up for him, and he would sit at the table there by himself. This picture that was taken was in 1973 in October, and they would have an annual meeting of the Grand Lodge of Kentucky. They would meet at the Masonic home, and they would have a program in the hall, in the auditorium of the school building, which is in the background. And of course, this man had been elevated to the position of Grand Master. This is Dr. Bob Wilhite from Lexington, Kentucky. And he's got his tux, he's got his top hat on, and it just happened to be a situation where 3 of the girls were there, and I got a picture with them. It's Kathy Chapman on the left, Carolyn Stewart, part of the Stewart family, and then Carol Hahn. This is included as a picture on the stage during the little program that the kids had to put on for all the members of the Masonic lodges. And this picture, standing at the microphone, was Joyce Meyer and Carolyn Stewart. This group of pictures, which is one of the few times that I lived, actually the only time that I lived there that I did anything in color. The lady in the yellow dress was Mrs. Anna Akers. And at the period of time when the home had a school, she was the dramatic arts teacher. And she was dramatic. So every year she would come back and she would help the kids put these little shows together that we had to put on for the different functions. So they were doing she was getting an honorary plaque for something. I forgot exactly what it was. So they had all the kids meet in one of the rooms of the school building. And this is when they were doing the presentation. And again, like I said, I did it in color. Never did it that way again. This next picture in that same group, that's Miss Johnson getting stuff ready for a little snack, and that's Diana Brown standing there looking at her. This picture in that same group, there was a song, I think it was a song that Cher put out. Was it Cherokee Indian? I think that was a song. Anyway, the girls got together and they did a little sitting down dance routine to the song. The girls would be Carolyn Stewart in the center. To her left was Donna Brown with the braids. Carol Hahn, Connie Meyer with the blonde hair with her back to me, and then her sister Joyce. This picture, the lady on the right, Cora Chambers, she had become the matron, as they called it. She was in charge of the girls. And then the 2 girls next to her is Debbie Walker in the center and Virgie Bowman on the left. Jack Stewart's in the background with a couple of the executives. This group of pictures, there is Miss Johnson in the blue dress, Richie Brown, and the lady sitting next to him in the white dress was Mrs. Other. She was one of those that always was, I think, on a sugar high because she was always so happy. And she could have a high-pitched voice. So sometimes that's how the guys would imitate her, was with that high-pitched voice. This last picture in that group, another one of the favorites. This time I didn't set the camera up, I just took the picture. But I got a group of us together, that were still there, and we took the picture. It was sort of a throw together, so some people weren't ready, and I just took it and I didn't take a second one. On the front row was Joe Klinkenbeard with the blue shirt, Debbie Walker, Kathy Chapman, Diana Brown. Back row with her hands up was Susie Meyer, her sister Connie, the other sister Joyce, the three Meyer sisters, Carolyn Stewart, Donna Brown, Gary Meyer, brother to the three sisters, Carol Hahn, Sam Brown, who was Donna's brother, and then Doyle Stewart. This gets into Christmas, and at Christmas time, we had to do another show. I was really getting fairly proficient with the camera, so I was off to the side taking pictures. Sometimes these shows would be the same routine all year long, but that is Donna and Joyce. This next picture is Donna's older sister, Debbie Brown, Carolyn Stewart, Kathy Chapman. Let's see, this picture is Debbie, Joyce, and Carolyn, and most of it was singing parts. This picture is Joyce and her brother Gary Meyer. The next picture, they were doing a Christmas around the world. So the Dutch girl was Diana Brown. Virgie was supposed to be representing something like a Native American. Not quite sure what Susie was doing, that's in the white dress. Kathy was doing Scotland, and Debbie was doing Japan. This next picture is very interesting, still one of our favorites. Jack Stewart was a good singer and a guitar player. We would get together a lot of times. He introduced me to artists like Chris Christopherson. Never had heard of the guy until I met Jack. Jack loved John Denver. He did a fantastic version of Take Me Home Country Roads. The person sitting next to Jack was one of our high school classmates, Rick Uxner. He did not live at the home, but his mother did. And his mother would tell me in the years before she passed away, it was one of her proudest moments to see him up there, the two of them together doing, I think it was Country Roads, seeing them together, to see him up on that same stage that she had performed on years before. This next picture, I was standing on one side of the stage, and a group of the kids were standing on the other side getting ready to do their parts, and I caught this picture. Diana Brown, Brian Stewart, looks like Carolyn and Donna, I believe. Now I got to the other side of the stage, and this is when some of the kids were out doing a song. So it's Richie in the plaid pants, which were so popular at that time. Joyce in the long dress, and Joyce and Gary Meyer together, Gary with the suit on. The last picture of this group, I think it was Jack playing Santa Claus. Santa Claus comes out to hand out some gifts to the kids. This next picture happened in March of '74. The high school allowed us, once you had your credits, you could graduate at any time. You didn't have to wait till the end of the senior year. Carol Hahn and I decided to take our diplomas early. We graduated in February 28, 1974. Carol was going to get married a month after we finished high school. So this was our Masonic home mafia. The person in the center is Randy Hahn. That's Gary's older brother, who had lived at the home at one time, and then his mother took him out, and then he was already an adult by the time his mother died. So there's Gary, and then the guys in the white tuxedos. From the left to the right, Jack Stewart, Gary Meyer, Richie Brown, and Gary Hahn, which is Randy's younger brother. The hat that Jack was wearing, I don't know where he picked that up, but he wore that hat all year, all through our senior year. So it was natural that he would wear that hat when he got the picture taken. And then the two buildings in the background, the one in the far left background, that was the school building, and the one in the closer foreground was the backside of the main dining hall. This next picture was in early spring of 1974. Jack's older brother Leland, who had left the home in 1969, had came in for a visit, and he and Jack were taking a walk away from our building toward the entrance, which was farther up the front. I happened to be outside with my camera, and I had a 300 millimeter lens on it, and I took this picture of the two of them walking, and because I had that style of lens on there, it distorted the proportions. It compressed everything, so the distance between us was a lot farther than it looks in this picture. But it's always become a fan favorite, and again, there's Jack wearing that hat. April 3rd, 1974 is a date that they still remember in Louisville, Kentucky. Weather patterns were changing, and all through the summer of 1973, we had tornado warnings, but nothing ever happened. On April 2nd, there was a tornado that hit Campbellsville, Kentucky. So April 3rd, now the weather people could see this coming because we didn't have the technology available today that we had then. People didn't realize what was happening. But there was a massive front coming across the Rocky Mountains and a massive front that was coming up out of the Gulf of Mexico, and they were going to collide from the Great Lakes all the way to Alabama. That afternoon, I was already out of high school. I was working at the Masonic Homes laundry room while I waited to start college. We got out of work at 3 o'clock. Dinner was at 4:45 at the dining hall. I was back at my room and had dozed off. Woke up, looked at my watch. It's time to go to the dining hall. I walked outside. I walked down to a clearing. I looked toward the west, and the whole sky was boiling. There was no funnel. It looked like boiling water. One of the maintenance supervisors and it was there with me, and I said, "What is it?" He said, "What do you think that is?" When we looked, there was a widow walking to the dining hall who had no idea what was coming straight toward us. So he ran for her, and I ran into the main dining hall. Didn't know what to say. All these women are sitting there. The kids hadn't got there yet. The women are sitting there, and one of the workers was there. And dummy me said, "Don't go outside. We've got a funnel cloud over top of us." And I remember we looked out the window, and it looked like boiling water. So this lady started gathering all the women, trying to get them down into the basement. That's when I ran into the other room, and that's when we found Helen frozen stiff. She couldn't move. She was so scared. The storm, fortunately, went just north of us. We didn't take a direct hit, but it passed. It was moving at 60 miles an hour. It was here and gone before you could realize it. I think they have since classified it as an F5 tornado. It did do damage to some of the main property. You can see trees uprooted. It also had a tendency to pull stuff right toward it. There was milk crates that were on the back of the landing deck of the dining hall, and they were pulled across the field in the direction of that storm. The one tree at the bottom of the picture was a tree next to the dining hall, and as you can see, it fell toward the dining hall. I don't know if it hit it and bounced off, but it didn't crash into the building. There were some more trees. The one thing that caught my eye was the branch that had been driven straight into the ground. I remember looking out. Things were happening so fast that as I ran into the dining hall, I looked behind me, and our flagpole in the center of the campus was whipping back and forth. At the back end of the property, where the forest was at that I'd shown early pictures of, it did take a direct hit. Every tree was either damaged or destroyed, and they were all pointing in the same direction. They all pointed toward the direction the storm went. What was interesting is even though the trees were uprooted, their taproots still remained in the ground, and when they all bloomed. The leaves came out of all these trees when they were laying sideways. I went back there a few weeks later and set up the tripod and took some pictures of myself standing next to it. Now, at the back end of the Masonic home property was Chenoweth Elementary School. So with the younger kids who were in grade school, that's where they got bused to every morning. It took a direct hit. And when I went back out the next day, I climbed the fence and walked up to the back of the school and stuck my camera through the window. And this was what would have been the cafeteria and stage. The exhaust stack for the incinerator collapsed in on top of the roof, and the roof came down. If there had been kids in there, it would have crushed every one of them. It literally destroyed that whole portion of the school. Fortunately, I got out of there right away because a member of the National Guard came around right after I'd taken the picture. This next picture, I'm standing on the cliff looking toward the northeast across Brownsboro Road, and at that time, these homes in these 3 subdivisions were the most expensive homes in Louisville. In 1974, these homes were going for $100,000 or more, and it turned them into toothpicks. Behind the home, by the school, it picked up a car and literally rolled it across the parking lot like a piece of tumbleweed until it landed up against a phone booth. Now this is the next day. If you look real closely in the background of the picture, there's a mailman picking up mail. Bottom picture, apartment buildings in the background that were taken out. You can tell what year it was just by looking at the cars. And if you notice something we don't see anymore, there was a photo mat booth there. I walked all over the area those next couple of days taking pictures of the damage. Always amazed me how the tornado took out the first floor of the house and left the second floor standing. But these are the different areas. Crescent Hill took pretty much a rough hit. A lot of this stuff was just demolished. The water treatment plant took a power hit, so there was no water for a couple of days. One of the sidebars on this, there was a party store across the street from us, and there was an elderly gentleman who worked in there. We always called him Grover. He asked me if I'd go to his house and take pictures because he was living in the house that took a direct hit, and they had just enough time to get into their basement. He said he's seen his house literally move. Found out it wasn't bolted to the foundation. He had a tree in his living room when I went to take the pictures, but he needed pictures for insurance. In November of 1973, they moved the Our Lady to another part of the campus, and they hired this woman, Mrs. Edith DeWitt. Her husband had been a member of the Masonic Lodge, and when he passed away, she ended up getting a job at the home, and she became in charge of us, and we always referred to her as Miss Edith. Sweetest woman you could ever meet. Had a lot to put up with us boys, but she was there for 3 years before she got remarried and then moved on. But it was like a breath of fresh air. She and Mrs. Chambers would always take walks at night, and I happened to be there and caught a picture of them out on the campus one night, and that was with Carolyn. Like I said, she was a very religious, very wonderful woman. And when her second husband passed away and she became more and more frail, she asked to be sent to the Masonic home to be taken care of. I remember my wife asking me one time, why is she living there when she could be living with her kids? And the simple answer was, first of all, she knew she'd be taken care of. She wanted to live there. And they took care of all the medical issues she had up until she passed away in the early 2000s. My kids even got to meet her a couple of times. This next picture, again, is in the dining hall. And this is going to be around 1975. So I'm already out on my own. I'm in college, but I came back to visit. And that's when I caught a couple more pictures in the dining hall. I'll give you an idea what it looked like back then. First picture has Richie Brown and Donna Brown, no relation, just sitting at one of the tables. Bottom picture had Stan Stewart with his brother Doyle sitting at one of the tables, and then Steve Bowling was there. He was working there at the time, and that's how I got his picture. This next picture, the Cherokee and Seneca Parks, the creek that ran through those parks was designed to be a drainage so that all the massive amounts of water would flood the park instead of flooding homes. We went out there. It was Stan Stewart on the stump, his brother Doyle to the right, and Bill Adams, another one of the kids, to the left. And we barely got out of there because the water was rising so fast. This next photograph was one looks like could have been a fall afternoon. The boys would go camping. You could go camping on the back grounds as long as you were there in time for breakfast in the morning. So Stan Stewart, Doyle Stewart, and the boy on the right, Reuben Klinkebeard, whose family had came there in 1973, were going to go camping. Very seldom did it ever happen that a child at the Masonic home passed away. In 1975, Virgie Bowman, at first they thought it was a curvature of the spine, but she was diagnosed with spinal cancer, and she lived till 1979. And they put her in the infirmary. Sometimes they had to send her to the children's hospital, but she went back and forth. But she always loved it when somebody would come to visit her, and she was always so excited. So this picture was taken, I think, in 1975, or maybe 76, around that time. We were up there, and Dennis, and Virgie's in her wheelchair, and Dennis is there, and I took a picture of the two of them. And as you can see, even though as sick as Virgie was, she was just so happy that she had a visitor. Unfortunately, as far as I know, she only had one sister. We don't know who I never met. Don't know whatever happened to her. But again, Virgie passed away in 1979 at the age of 18. We had a print shop. It was a real, honest-to-God print shop located on the grounds, and I hung around there a lot. Got to know all the guys who worked there, and got to even got a little bit of idea how the stuff worked. Seeing all the different, they had the offset printers, they had the giant printers like you'd see in a newspaper. They had the linotype machines, which nobody even knows what those are anymore, where the men would sit there and they would have the molten lead and they would type out, and it would type out stuff that would then create print. That the one gentleman sitting there in the black and white picture with the glasses on looking at me, he was a typesetter. So his job was to take all that stuff and then set it into these forms, and so that they could then be put on a press, that they could press a Masonic home newspaper off of. One of the guys that was there, Mr. Dave Hall, I got to know him in 1972. He always called me, "Hey fella." And the thing about Dave was a Masonic home kid. He had lived there from like the late 40s till around 1956 when he finished high school. And not too long afterwards, he ended up working at the print shop. We'd always have discussions, and over the years I'd see him, so I've got some pictures of him from the 70s and then from the early 90s, and then the last picture when we have our reunions. Dave's in his early 80s now, and he still shows up to the reunion. Fact is, he was there this past summer. And when I walk up to him, because I recognize him probably faster than he recognized me, I'd walk up to him and then go, "Hey fella," and then as soon as I said that, he knew who it was. Now, this is the Grand Master's Day in 1976. I've been out of the Masonic home for 2 years now. But I came back to visit for this service, and fortunately I took it in color. It was Richie Brown was a senior, so he was graduating from high school. So all the seniors always had to give a speech if they went through this program. So a lot of this is just pictures of the different speeches. The one page, you got Richie, Susie Meyer, Donna Brown, Stan Stewart. We got Donna, Stan, Billy Meyer. One girl named Kim Lefevre, who was from southeastern Kentucky, but she wasn't there very long. Her family took her back not too long after she arrived. You got some more. You got Brian, Kathy, Diana. Now, the little girl who was almost about 4 years old when I took this picture, Jeannie Klinknebeard, her two older brothers, Reuben and Joe, were there. They all came in at the same time. And when Jeannie came in, she was the youngest child who ever lived at the Masonic home. Normally they wouldn't take them until they were 3 years old, but they made a special exception for her. And she stayed there for 3 or 4 years. The lady that was in charge of the girls, Mrs. Chambers, eventually would marry her father, because their mother had died years earlier, would marry their father, and Jeannie went back to live with them. I'm not sure. It could have been the brothers didn't want to go, but the brothers stayed at the home. Again, we have Miss Johnson. The gentleman in the background with the glasses, with the stern look on his face and the bald head, was Mr. von Schluter. He was now the current, at this time, he became the current superintendent. There was a white Cadillac coming around the grounds. Nobody really paid any attention to it, but shortly afterwards, one of the executives walked up to the microphone and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a very special guest, Mr. Colonel Harlan Sanders." It turned out that he was there looking for his son, but he got cornered, and he had to come up front, and he had to make a little speech. And for those who've never realized it, yes, there really was a Colonel Sanders who started Kentucky Fried Chicken. I don't think anybody ever seen him without that white suit, black bow tie, and his little goatee. Looked like traditional Southern gentleman. I actually got to walk up to him. I sort of hid in the back because my hair was so long. I walked up to him and just to see what he was like up close. He was a short little guy compared to me. I think he was only about 5'7" or something. This was Miss Johnson in 1984? No, 76. This is Miss Johnson. She always allowed me to take the picture. Could never get her to smile, but she always allowed the picture. Now this next group of pictures, again, this was the St. John's Days picnic in 1976. That's Brian Stewart looking through from the back of one of the ticket booths. Gary Hahn with a movie camera. And I know he's got a movie. I'm actually in one of the clips of the movie. Stan Stewart looking at me like, what are you doing? On the merry-go-round, we've got Diana Brown and Susie Meyer. Now this is Carol Hahn. She came back to visit with her baby, her firstborn. It's Carolyn Stewart. Now Carolyn was in college already, so she was back visiting. This unique character who looks like a leprechaun was Steve Smith. He was the Masonic home attorney. And Steve and I got to know each other real well. I think they would have not been too happy that sometimes Steve would feed me information that I probably shouldn't have known. When I wanted to get my driver's license, all the kids before me had no problem getting a driver's license. When I wanted to get mine, the former superintendent, said he couldn't do it because he's not allowed to sign for anybody. Well, Steve Smith asked me one day, did you get your license? I said, no. He says he can't sign for it. He goes, what do you mean he can't sign for it? He can sign for it. Needless to say, shortly afterwards, we were going for the driver's test. There was a couple other times that Steve fed me some information that probably shouldn't have, but he was that kind of a character. And again, when you look at him, he looked like a leprechaun. He had he had red hair with the red beard, and he was sort of short. And if you put the hat on him, I'm sure he would have led me to a pot of gold. This was at that same period, one of the nights of during the picnic. In front of Cottage 4, it was just some of the kids got together. The guy with his back to me, that was Tony Walker. He had left the home. Brian Stewart, Donna Brown, Joyce Meyer, and then Tony's younger brother, Tim. His mother took him out when he was younger, so that's actually, unfortunately, that is the only photograph I have of Tim. Dennis Brown was a politician, still is. And a couple of times he decided to run for state representative. So the first time he decided to do it, he needed some pictures. So I had to follow him around everywhere and take photographs. Of course, he had to want to emphasize in his campaign literature that he had lived at the Masonic home. He did one by one of the expressways talking about how they needed to reconstruct it. The bottom picture was on the night of the election. We were all at his house watching the election returns. Dennis with the pipe, Stanley holding the pipe, and then Gary Hahn next to him holding a bottle of something. And unfortunately, Dennis didn't win that night. I think he tried 2 more times and wasn't successful, but he was always involved in the political arena. And then this, for the campaign, this was Dennis and his wife Linda. We're moving to 1977. In the back end of the farm, there was a creek. And the story I heard, at one time there used to be a small lake back there. For whatever reasons, for safety or whatever, the Masonic home decided to break the dam that was holding the water back and let the water flow out, so all you had was a creek. Well, Doyle Stewart and a couple of other ones decided they were going to dam it up. And they dammed it up, and they backed all the water up, and they basically recreated the lake. Doyle was your Rambo type. I think he served in the military also. I know the last I heard he was working as a private contractor in the Middle East. But Doyle decided he's going to be the Rambo guy. He's got his bow and arrow, and this was before Rambo ever was heard of. But he's got his bow and arrow, his hat. He's out there in the middle of the water. He's out there hiding in the overgrowth. And I don't know if the home tore it down or if a heavy rainstorm broke it. But the dam gave way. They even had a spillway on it. You see the dam? And there's a spillway. it finally gave way, and it let all the water out again. This is summer 1977. It's St. John Day's picnic again, but this time the Grand Master came in style. Local news corporation flew him in on a helicopter, and they had the ribbon cutting ceremony on the porch of the Cottage 2, which would eventually become the headquarters of the Grand Lodge of Kentucky. We had a ring the bell, I don't know what they call those things, but in the early days, you could hit that as hard as you could, and that bell that you couldn't ring the bell. Well, just before the start of the St. John Day's picnic in 1973, we were out there goofing around with it, and the pin slipped, and when they hit it, it caused it to crack the frame. And you couldn't just glue it back together. They had to specially weld it fast back together to get it into service, and they loosened the tension up on it. So at that point, anybody could ring the bell. So the way to drum up business, one of the boys would get out there with their hammer, and they'd ring that bell 10 times in a row. So that would cause, oh, I want to ring the bell. I want to ring the bell. Let me do it. So then they, those people were paying to ring the bell. Steve was there, basketball shot. Stan Stewart was there having food. One of the crazy pictures I tried that day, I'd seen this in Life magazine on how to do this, so I wanted to try it. So the one photograph are the rides at night. Of course, it's a timed photo, so that's why they're spinning. They're blurred like that. So when I tried the second shot, I had the camera on a shutter release, so I had the shutter open, and I started zooming in and out of the picture. And that's what created the lights like that. Again, this is summer 1977, and this is Dennis Brown and Stan Stewart. Stan was still at the home. He didn't leave the home until 1978. So he was going to be a senior in high school. Dennis was there visiting. I was there visiting, had the camera, of course. And nonchalantly, Dennis had a couple of his guns. We were back there on the back part of the property, back on the farm, and they were doing target practice. And, of course, the one picture we always get a chuckle out of is I pointed my camera at Dennis, and he pointed his gun at me. And in the olden days, he might even pulled the trigger. This picture, again, same time, or no, I take that, different time, different part of the year, same place. Dennis was with his brother Richie, and Stan are there doing target practice at something. I moved away from Louisville in January of 1978. So in the fall of 1978, I came back to visit, and I was visiting, and at the time I was visiting, Stan had just finished high school. He was at the University of Kentucky. He just happened to be in town. And his brother Brian was still a resident at the home. But the gentleman with the blue hat on was a man named Bill Blanton. He had lived at the home in the 50s and early 60s. He had came back to visit. And again, like I said, it was not uncommon for people to come back and visit all the time. That was Miss Johnson in 1978. I came back to visit in the fall of 1979. And again, Bill was there visiting. Brian was there. Brian would stay there for a couple of more years before he finished high school. And as I said, I'm standing here in the middle. I still had hair. Brian was growing some pumpkins, and he decided to show me one of the pumpkins. And as you can see, that's part of the property that the Masonic home owned, all the way back to the tree lines in the very far background. This is Doyle. He had caught a fox. That was Doyle. He could catch something like that barehanded and not even think about it. But he had caught a fox. And then the final pictures of this in 1979 was one of the other kids who had lived at the home. Mike Wolf had been at the home. His father was originally from Kentucky, but he was living in Chicago when his mother had already passed. His father died. He ended up being sent back to Louisville to live at the Masonic home. He lived there from 1967 till he graduated high school in 1972. The person standing with him is what would become his wife in the future. Sadly, I haven't heard from Mike in decades. We don't know whatever happened to him. those are the pictures for the years that I lived there and the times I came back to visit. Even though we all lived at the Masonic home for either many years or just a few years, the Masonic home did not allow kids to be adopted out. They were basically a guardian. If the child's parent or parents or whatever was deemed was acceptable, they could petition the courts to have their kids returned to them. And so that happened to several of the kids. Some kids didn't want to leave. They wanted to stay there. But anyway, we consider ourselves family. We're almost like brothers and sisters. No matter when we lived there, it's your brother or sister. We have an annual reunion. It's usually now the last weekend of June, and it's held at the Masonic home. We have a breakfast at what we still refer to as the dining hall. It is now called the Olmsteads. It is a high-end reception center. All the walls have been painted nice bright colors. All the woodwork has been painted bright colors, nice lights, and it's air conditioned. And I guess it costs a small fortune for somebody to rent the hall for a reception. But in 2017, it was the 150th anniversary of the establishment of the Kentucky Masonic home. And a bunch of us from my group got together, and they had a professional photographer who was taking family pictures, so we decided to take a family picture. And we all squeezed in so tight that it could have got messy if we'd have squeezed in any tighter. But this is our official family portrait. So in this picture, we've got from the left to the right, we got Reuben Klinkenbeard with his hands on Richie Brown's shoulder. Standing behind Richie is Jack Stewart. Gary Myers is standing in front of him. There's Carolyn Stewart on the front, standing next to Susie Myers, standing next to Donna Brown, her younger sister Diana Brown. There's Dennis Brown, and he and Richie were brothers, but not related to the other Brown family. There's Leland Stewart, part of the Stewart clan. In the back rows, Steve Bowling is the tallest. He's the one standing in the dead center with the white hair and white beard. I'm standing to Steve's right, with no hair. Sam Brown is standing next to Dennis's left, right behind his sister Donna. Brian Stewart is there in the back, standing next to Gary Hahn. And we still try as much as we can. We still try to get together once a year. Sadly, we are becoming the last of the people who lived there. Because there were no more home kids after 1989, this is just weird what's left of it. When we still have the reunions, as my son found out this year, you will find people who would live there if they're still able to make it, they lived there in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. We still come to this reunion, and it's so funny is that every decade has so many different stories to tell. Gary Hahn has said he's been trying to write a book. I really wish somebody could make a movie on Miss Johnson's life, because that would cover 5 decades of this place. And again, it wasn't the best of choices, but in my case, I had no place else to go. I asked to be sent there. A lot of kids were sent there when they were very young because their families couldn't take care of them. And I always think about today, a person who needed help, there would be nobody to turn to. And even though this was an orphanage, we were not like Shirley Temple. We were well taken care of and made the best of what we had. So it was quite an experience. And sometimes I regret the fact that I only lived there for 2 years. And sometimes I wondered what would have happened if my mom would have sent me there in 1962. But for me, I've got 2 complete different storylines. I've got a whole growing up in Eastern Kentucky and then moving to Louisville and getting to know all those folks. So that's my story. And every one of these kids in this picture has a story that they could tell. and I thank you for taking time to listen to mine.